Hi, this video that I'm putting together today is on the topic of 5-MeO-DMT reactivations. And this is a very special topic within the world of the 5-MeO-DMT experience where people feel the effects of 5-MeO-DMT sometimes long after having actually worked with this particular entheogenic molecule. Sometimes these, quote, reactivations can be very disturbing, they can be unsettling, they can produce anxiety, and even sometimes deep medical concerns that maybe something is wrong or that people have damaged themselves in some way. And so I thought it'd be useful to just put together a video talking about what reactivations are, what we, quote, know about them versus what we don't know about them, the different kinds of reactivations that take place with 5-MeO-DMT, and also how to work with them and not just try to make them stop or try to avoid them, but actually embrace them and work with them as an ongoing process of energetic reformatting that takes place within your being and within your body after having consumed 5-MeO-DMT. So I've put together a list of notes that I've got over here on the side of my computer, and I'm just going to be kind of working through those and sharing. And also, just to let you know that if you like to process information via reading, then I've got a couple books for you that I'm going to recommend right off the top. The first is my book, Entheogenic Liberation, Unraveling the Enigma of Non-Duality with 5-MeO-DMT Energetic Therapy. This is a book that I wrote back in 2017 and is basically the most comprehensive and detailed book about the 5-MeO-DMT experience that you can find out there. And it covers all of these kinds of topics that I'm going to be discussing in this video today. And so it just gives you some more information about that. Also, this year, 2024, I wrote and released this book, 5-MeO-DMT Integration, Embodying Non-Duality is Not What You Think. Also covers the topic of reactivations in quite a bit of detail and covers many of the things that I'm going to be talking about here about how to work with them and even induce them if that's something that you are interested in. And I'll also share that a lot of this information that I'm giving you not only comes out of my own personal experience with 5-MeO-DMT, but also as a professional 5-MeO-DMT integration coach. So I do work with clients from around the world who are bringing their 5-MeO-DMT experiences to me, and also what the after effects are in terms of these reactivations and events that are happening after they've had 5-MeO-DMT. So I've got a lot of experience in this area, and I'm happy to share some of that experience with you here in this video. So let's just start with a brief history of the idea of reactivations with 5-MeO-DMT. So it all begins actually with me, as far as I'm aware, in that I experienced my first, quote, reactivation from a 5-MeO-DMT experience in the winter of 2008. And when that happened to me, the person who had served me 5-MeO-DMT had never heard of this happening before and basically was unaware of it. And there was very little information available publicly at that time about 5-MeO-DMT. So there was no discussion boards, there was no online groups talking about this phenomenon. It was basically unheard of. So for me, this is how it happened. After my second experience, well, my first experience with 5-MeO-DMT came in January of 2008. My second experience was either at the end of that month or maybe the beginning of February, not exactly certain when that was. But both of my experiences with 5-MeO-DMT were very powerful, full non-dual experiences. Then the day after my second experience with 5-MeO-DMT, I was sitting in my apartment, cross-legged in meditation position, and as I was exhaling at the very start of my meditation, I said Om, and it came out kind of like Om. And as I was saying that Om and feeling those vibrations, the thought came, oh, I could follow this all the way. And by all the way, I mean all the way into the non-dual experience, such as what I had just had in my 5-MeO-DMT experience. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, that I just followed that breath and followed that all the way into this infinitely expansive state. And I just rested in that state for maybe 20, 25 minutes. I'm not entirely certain, wasn't keeping track of time. And then at some point, the thought arose within my ego of, oh shit, I don't know how to get back. That here I am in this infinite expanded state, and I don't even know where my body is, let alone how do I get back to it. And at that point, I started vibrating physically within my body. I kind of fell down off of my meditation cushion. And it took a while for me to feel like all that energy was kind of coming back into the confined body space. And just felt absolutely ecstatic as I was coming back, and found that I started rolling around on the ground on my back, and my legs were going up into the air and kind of doing these weird body postures and movements that I didn't really come to understand until quite some time later. But this was one of the early iterations of what later came to be called fractal energetic yoga, which I'll return to in this talk. And it was thrilling. I had been a practitioner of meditation for many, many years before this, and never once ever had my meditation ever been anything even remotely like this experience. So it seemed very clear to me that my prior experience with 5-MeO-DMT led me to be able to make these really profound breakthroughs within the meditation, and I was able to choose to allow that to take place. And then on the come down from that was always accompanied by lots of vibrations in the body, and even reaching the point of sort of convulsions, lying on the floor and convulsing, and hands and legs and feet vibrating like that. And that lasted for about a good 2 weeks. Pretty much every day I would sit down and meditate, and I would go into a very similar state. And from that very first one, that state that I was going into felt largely indistinguishable from having taken 5-MeO-DMT. Now, when that first one happened, after I felt that I was kind of back, I called up the person who had served me, who was Hal from the Temple of Awakening Divinity. And his response at the time was, wow, I've never heard of that happening. He was still relatively new to serving and facilitating 5-MeO-DMT experiences. And he also said, wow, you got a free ride. I'm jealous. So that was the first any of us in this new 5-MeO-DMT community had ever heard of this kind of phenomenon taking place. And because it was happening to me every day for like 2 weeks as I was meditating, followed by lots of vibrating in the body, I became a little bit concerned, like, what's all this vibrating about? What's going on here? And it was suggested that perhaps I do some energetic processing with ayahuasca, and so that ended up getting me over to the local Santo Daime church here in Ashland, where they serve ayahuasca as a religious sacrament. And then that precipitated drinking lots of ayahuasca over a number of months, always accompanied by lots of vibrating in the body. So there was still a lot of energy that was running and processing. And then also going back to the Temple of Awakening Divinity and getting a 5-MeO-DMT experience once every month or two. So that was the first appearance of a reactivation. And again, at that time, there was no public information about this out there anywhere to be found. So I had never heard of it. The person who served me had never heard of it. And it was not generally known that this was a potential of working with 5-MeO-DMT. Okay, next was several months later, I was in a new relationship and brought my new partner, Jessalyn, with me to the Temple of Awakening Divinity for her to be able to experience 5-MeO-DMT. And actually, we were not in a relationship when we first went to the Temple of Awakening Divinity. We were still just getting to know each other. But then upon maybe her second or third visit to the Temple of Awakening Divinity, at which point we were a couple and were living together and sleeping in the same bed at that point. After her second or third experience, I woke up one night in the middle of the night, sometime between 2 and 3 a.m., to find that she was awake. And in fact, she was in the shower. And I went over to like, what are you doing? And she said, I'm having a 5-MeO DMT experience. And so she had gone to the shower to try and ground herself and try to settle. And she found it to be very disturbing. And this repeated pretty much every night for about 2 weeks, where she would wake up sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning. And the sensations and experience that she was having was that she was fully back in the 5-MeO DMT experience. And this was just happening every night. And for the first several nights, it was extremely intense for her. And then over the 2-week time period, those reactivations started to lessen in intensity. And then by the end of 2 weeks or so, they had completely washed out and she was not experiencing that anymore. So this was a different kind of reactivation. Obviously, this was very different than me sitting in meditation and just following my energy into that deep state of open expansion and infinity. Here, this was something that was happening to her that she was not looking for and was breaking into her normal sleep cycle. And both of these, we now know, are very common kinds of reactivations that occur with 5-MeO DMT, where people experience much, much deeper and more profound meditation if they're a meditation practitioner. And then the second one is what is now known as night school, that it's so common that it's gotten this kind of cutesy name of, well, you're going to night school now. But when this happened to myself and to my then girlfriend and now wife, Jesslyn, we had never heard of this before. And again, there was no information available anywhere out there in the world about this phenomenon. So I started to call these experiences spontaneous endogenous 5-MeO DMT releases. And I shared that with Hal from the Temple of Awakening Divinity, and he said, oh, that's much too long and clumsy of a name. How about reactivations? Let's call them reactivations. And that seemed like a good fit, so I started calling them reactivations and sharing about this on my podcast, The Entheogenic Evolution. And now, today, around the world, this is part of the common parlance around 5-MeO DMT, that this term, reactivations, is used pretty much by everyone, and it's an expected part of working with 5-MeO DMT. Going back to the phrase that I used for it, spontaneous endogenous 5-MeO DMT release, that actually is a bit trickier of a phrase because the human body does produce 5-MeO DMT. That's what endogenous means, within the body. So as a mammal, all mammals produce trace amounts of 5-MeO DMT, and our body can make it. It is inside us. But usually in just very, very small trace amounts. But this is a bit of a loaded phrase and saying a spontaneous endogenous 5-MeO DMT release, because I don't actually have any scientific evidence that that is what is actually taking place within the body. It certainly feels like it. It seems like this is what's happening, is that the body is producing more because, again, for many people who are experiencing a really deep reactivation, it presents in a way that is very difficult to distinguish from having just smoked or vaporized 5-MeO DMT. It also is quite common for people who are having these reactivations to claim that they can smell 5-MeO DMT, they can taste 5-MeO DMT, sometimes they can even taste it in their sweat on their body, or you smell your armpit, it's like, wow, that smells like 5-MeO DMT. But we don't actually know if that's what the body is doing or not. Now, especially when it comes to these nighttime reactivations in night school, one of the theories that's been put out there, which I'm just going to go ahead and just completely disagree with, is that perhaps it is related to the production of melatonin in the body. So melatonin, as a tryptamine molecule, is structurally very similar to 5-MeO-DMT. And the production of melatonin in the body is a normal part of our circadian rhythm and our sleep cycle. And there have been a few cases of people who have had trouble sleeping after their 5-MeO-DMT experience and have claimed that they've taken melatonin to help themselves get to sleep, and then feel that that use of melatonin has triggered a reactivation. Now, I fundamentally disagree with this interpretation because, well, there's a lot of reasons because. One is that, yes, there are these nighttime reactivations, but there's lots of other kinds of reactivations that happen with 5-MeO-DMT that it would just be strange to associate that with melatonin in any way. The next reason is that our bodies don't actually produce melatonin when we are going to sleep or while we are asleep. The body produces melatonin after sundown, and it prepares the body for sleep several hours later. Now, melatonin, therefore, it cannot possibly be an explanation for why people wake up between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning in a full reactivation, because your body's not producing melatonin at that time. Now, another kind of reactivation that people experience is right as they are about to fall asleep, they feel this massive expansion of energy and they jolt awake and feel like they are back in a 5-MeO-DMT experience. Melatonin, as produced by the body, also would not explain this because, as I already said, the body produces melatonin several hours before we actually go to bed and go to sleep. So that's not something that we should be experiencing at that time. And if someone is taking melatonin and help themselves fall asleep, then yes, there's the potential that maybe that could contribute to it. But here again, I will also disagree. I am someone who has had lifetime difficulties with sleep. I have a rather complicated sleep disorder. And when I was at the worst stages of my sleep disorder, I was taking up to 12 milligrams of melatonin a night. And not once ever did it contribute to any sense of having a reactivation. So I don't see any kind of causal relationship between melatonin and quote-unquote night school reactivations, but maybe, maybe not. And again, are we producing more 5-MeO-DMT inside our bodies at that time? Maybe, maybe not. We don't have any scientific studies that have been done around that issue. So it's an open question. What is not an open question is that these phenomena absolutely take place, and of a level of power and intensity where it is difficult for people to distinguish between these reactivation events and having smoked or vaporized or otherwise consumed 5-MeO-DMT from an outside exterior source. So it's a very normal part of choosing to work with 5-MeO-DMT. And it is often very startling for people. These events feel very out of control. They feel very energetic, very expansive, and certainly can be frightening for people. And sometimes the level of fear is related to when and how these kinds of reactivations are taking place. So let's just spend a moment just to kind of talk about where are the different potentials that reactivations might take place and why might they be taking place. So let's kind of start with the why to begin with. For one, there is no other psychedelic out there in the world that has the same level of energetic intensity and expansiveness as a 5-MeO-DMT experience. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, but we can say, especially if you're vaporizing 5-MeO-DMT, your energetic experience goes from baseline to infinity within a few seconds, within a few heartbeats, and maybe even just 1 or 2 breaths. So it's a very dramatic onset where it feels like you're in your normal reality, and then within a few seconds, it's just, oh my God, everything is going to infinity. and it's usually experienced as high levels of energy within the body that are breaking apart our normal egoic structures of identification so that we could potentially move into a non-dual state. So the energetic intensity of 5-MeO-DMT is rather unique. You're not really going to get this kind of presentation from working with any other kind of psychedelic molecule. And then it gives rise to all different kinds of energetic processing that occurs within the experience of 5-MeO-DMT, where people have spontaneous movements in the body. There can be a lot of vocalizing, a lot of expressing. There's the possibility for glossolalia, or quote unquote speaking in tongues, what I like to just call energy language. There can be large demonstrations within the body of energy, of people really getting big, getting cathartic, getting very dramatic, screaming, yelling. There's the potential for full body orgasms. And this is just what happens when people let go all the way within the experience. Now, it's always possible for the ego to hold on and to resist and to fight within this, even though that's never recommended. But what that means is that sometimes people end up fighting with the energy of the experience, and that also is usually embodied in a very dramatic way, where people writhe about, they flip from side to side, they try and run away from the experience, they scream, they cry, they beg for help. There's lots of different things that happen. But it's all because we're feeling this incredibly intense amount of energy, which has the potential to go to infinite levels of experience. So that's a lot of energy to process. And then even if the ego does let go all the way, eventually the energetic structures of the ego, which create the sense of you as a character who has certain mannerisms, certain ways of speaking, tone of voice, all of these things, these are all just patterns of the ego. And they're by definition limitations on the infinite energy that we are. As these structures come back, they can be out of alignment with this free and open expression of energy. So then people can experience all different kinds of resistance or discomfort, and there might be purging, there might be crying that needs to take place. And then there's also often a lot of vibrating and convulsing that takes place in the body, where people might feel certain targeted areas of their body vibrating and convulsing, and other times it's the entire body. Lots of times there's vibrations in the arms, in the legs, in the hands, in the feet. So it can show up all across our embodied physical being. And just as with the body itself, which is just a bunch of energy, our emotions, these are energies, thoughts, these are energies, the way we express ourselves, these are energetic patterns. And so the 5-MeO-DMT has the possibility of interacting with all these different levels and layers of our being, and to clear out repressed energies, to connect us to our authentic energy and authentic expression. And then as the ego comes back, there's all different kinds of repressions and possible confinements or judgments or withholdings or limitations. So the whole event is very energetically oriented. Now, introducing that amount of energy into your being can be very difficult to process and ground all the way through in what is usually a relatively short session with 5-MeO-DMT. So it's kind of like we set off this energy bomb within the core of our being that just goes bam, and it goes to infinity. And then the non-infinite, the finite egoic self comes back in and tries to contain all that energy. It's very normal to understand that reverberations from that energetic impact and processing, that's going to need to continue beyond the event with 5-MeO-DMT itself. And that's what these reactivations primarily seem to be. So there are a few generalities that we can make. One is that having ongoing reactivations tends to be more a normal part of the process for people who are very new to 5-MeO-DMT, because they have not gone through a lot of what I like to call the energetic reformatting and processing that occurs with 5-MeO-DMT. In other words, the human ego, the energetic structures of the human ego, are very good at bringing us out of alignment with ourselves at an infinite, liberated, and unbound level. So that this process of reformatting ourselves through this energy work with 5-MeO-DMT has the ability to bring us into deeper alignment with ourselves over time. And that's a process. It doesn't happen all at once. It is something that takes time. So the more we work with 5-MeO-DMT, usually the less explosive and out of control the events are, and it becomes more and more focused and more centered. And also the longer amount of time that goes between sessions with 5-MeO-DMT, the more likely we are to return to repressing energies or going back into dysfunctional behavioral patterns, emotional patterns, mental patterns, expressive patterns. So we tend to get more dramatic results from 5-MeO-DMT when people are relatively new to the experience. And here again, this is when we tend to see a lot more reactivations. These take place after these initial encounters with 5-MeO-DMT. There's still a lot of processing to take place. A person has not fully grounded into a more authentically aligned state yet, so these energies need to keep working after the event with 5-MeO-DMT itself. It is also, I think this is a good general rule of thumb, that the more the person freely embodies and expresses the energy of the 5-MeO-DMT experience within this session with the medicine itself, the more likely they are to finish their session in a more grounded and aligned state, and therefore are less likely to be experiencing especially disruptive reactivations afterwards. But those individuals actually might be more available to having the intentional induction of a 5-MeO-DMT reactivation, say through meditation, because it's not that they haven't completed their energetic process, but they've grounded into a new state so that then they can expand more easily. But I think that especially things like night school, which in most cases are unwanted forms of reactivations because they really do disturb sleep quite significantly, I think that those are much more likely to show up with somebody who leaves a session with 5-MeO-DMT in an ungrounded state, meaning that perhaps they demonstrated a lot of resistance throughout their session with 5-MeO-DMT. Maybe they fought with it all the way through. Maybe they had a freak out that never resolved into a relaxed and open state. Therefore, there's a much bigger energetic burden on them for continuing to process and integrate after the session. The more you can embody and express that energy authentically within the session with 5-MeO-DMT itself, the more integrated the entire experience is, and again, the less likely you are to experience unwanted reactivations afterwards. Okay, so we've already covered reactivations through meditation and also night school reactivations. But there are other forms of reactivations that take place. One I would just call movement reactivations. It is very often the case that an experience with 5-MeO-DMT is accompanied with spontaneous movements within the body. In other words, people move around a lot, but they are not consciously choosing to move. Often these movements are of this nature, or there's this kind of rolling over kind of action that takes place. And it can kind of look like a dance, or maybe doing yoga or Tai Chi or something like that. And that always keep in mind that your body remembers everything, even if you don't. And all of our experiences, all of our past experiences, including our traumas and everything, they're all encoded within the body. It's all accessible within the body. So sometimes what happens after a 5-MeO experience is maybe somebody goes to ecstatic dance and they start dancing around, and maybe they start doing some of these moves that were similar to what showed up within their 5-MeO experience, and then they feel like, whoa, it's taking over and it's happening now. So this can show up with dance, particularly free-form expressive dance. It can also show up if people practice Tai Chi or Qigong or yoga. And it's also something that can show up when people are engaged physically in sexual acts, where people are moving their bodies in ways that are very similar to, say, the full body orgasm that might have taken place within their 5-MeO session. And particularly orgasm itself, holds the potential to bring people back into that 5-MeO-DMT state, and that can be experienced as a reactivation. And sometimes this can be startlingly so, where you're making love with your partner and you hit the point of orgasm, and then it's just, oh my God, it keeps going, and I'm losing track of my body and where am I and what's going on. But that's very common with these more movement-related reactivations taking place. Another way that reactivations can take place is if there are various memory triggers that you encounter. So it's very common, especially in earlier experiences with 5-MeO-DMT, that people might not remember all of their experience. So there's this phenomenon of having whiteouts or blackouts. But again, the body remembers, even if you, the character, the egoic persona, you might not remember, but your body does. So any of the senses that were involved within your experience, they might serve as a trigger point for opening up a reactivation afterwards. So some of these are music. If there was music played in your session with 5-MeO-DMT, even if you weren't aware of the music as you were going through your process, if you hear that same piece of music later, after your 5-MeO experience, there's a very good chance that it will trigger some kind of reactivation within you. Whereas, oh yeah, that music and that feeling that came with that music, here it is, and it opens up and presents. Also, you may suddenly have a thought that was similar to something that you thought within your 5-MeO experience. And simply thinking that thought suddenly triggers like, oh yeah, and that there's the experience again. Same holds for emotions. It's really common that people process really big, deep emotions on 5-MeO-DMT. And sometimes like overwhelming gratitude or a sense of awe in the face of overwhelming beauty. Like you might go outside and you look at this amazing sunset and you're just like, oh yeah, that's that feeling. And it can happen. Also, smells and scents. Like if there are some plants out there that produce flowers that kind of smell a little bit reminiscent of 5-MeO-DMT. And even mothballs, actually, the scent of mothballs is somewhat similar to the scent of 5-MeO-DMT. So sometimes people smell something. And you've probably experienced this in other contexts where maybe you smell something that reminds you of your childhood and suddenly all these memories come flooding back. Well, same thing can happen where you smell something that is reminiscent of 5-MeO-DMT and it doesn't just bring the memory back, it actually opens up the experience itself. And this is very similar to yet another area where people might experience a reactivation is simply sharing or talking about their experience with someone else might trigger all of these energies again so that you go back into that same process and you start feeling and experiencing all of that again. So there's all different kinds of ways that we might experience these kinds of reactivations. Now, there also are people who would like to induce a reactivation and go back into that energetic experience so that they continue to process and express and explore that. Here, it's very common where even a small dose of cannabis after a 5-MeO-DMT session is very likely to trigger some kind of reactivation. Those sensations of all this energy opening up within the body, things becoming infinite, feeling these energies taking over, being out of control. And of course, this is also true when working with other psychedelics post 5-MeO-DMT. One of the things that 5-MeO-DMT is rather notorious for is turning other psychedelics into it, meaning that after a 5-MeO-DMT experience, you might go and take some psilocybin mushrooms and think, yeah, I just want to have a mushroom journey or a mushroom experience. But it actually turns into something that is way more similar to 5-MeO-DMT than any previous psilocybin mushroom experience you might have had. So it's just something to be aware of, that any use of anything that alters our sense of energy, anything that alters our sense of space and time and being after 5-MeO can trigger these reactivation kinds of events. Okay? And I guess lastly I'd say Some people use breath work to try and induce reactivations. And sometimes that's intentionally, sometimes that's not intentionally. But I actually would like to recommend not using breath work, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So, first of all, if you're experiencing reactivations, especially unwanted reactivations, the bad news is that you can't stop them. You cannot make them go away. And this can be a difficult choice to make, but the more you allow them and the more you embrace them, the more likely they actually are to complete their process and crest and break and move out and wash out on their own. But it's kind of similar to an experience with 5-MeO-DMT. Yes, you can fight with it all the way through, but that is not advised. That the best advice for working with 5-MeO-DMT is relax, surrender, trust, and let go. So the same thing applies if you're experiencing reactivations. This is the number one thing to do if you're experiencing reactivations, especially if they're unwanted, is just treat them as though you are in a session with 5-MeO-DMT and allow whatever energy is arising, allow it to take place and allow it to process. And the more you can do that, then the more whatever work it needs to do will get done, and you'll be able to move on and come back down to a more grounded state. So this advice that I'm about to give, this is what I give to anybody who's going to work with 5-MeO-DMT. And so the same applies in working with a reactivation. So first of all, if you're experiencing a reactivation, the normal egoic reaction is, oh shit, what do I do to stop this? This is out of control. I can't handle this. And so people react to it and try and avoid it. And usually that just makes blood pressure go up, makes the heart rate go up, it makes people hyperventilate. And sometimes people do go to the emergency room and they check themselves in. And usually the diagnosis is, well, you're having some kind of panic attack. I have never experienced a case where someone is having a reactivation and they actually need to go to the hospital or that they're getting anything useful from doing that. So what you want to do is, again, is treat it like you're in session with the medicine. So this kind of body posture, I like to call the neutral position. It's a relaxed, open body posture. There's no crossed limbs. You're open like this, and this is, as a body posture says, I'm ready to give, I'm ready to receive, and I'm not trying to protect myself. Versus this is like, oh, I'm trying to protect, I'm trying to hide, I'm trying to make it stop. And this is, oh, how do I get it out of me? And then like pacing back and forth is, oh, I'm anxious, how do I get rid of this? So whenever you feel these energies, it's important just to go into this relaxed position. And this is also where I encourage you to not attempt any kind of breath work exercises. The ideal breath is breathing in and out through your nose and just in a really relaxed, light manner, just letting your body breathe all on its own. Breath work is always the ego trying to manage breath in order to induce certain states of consciousness or being. And really what we want to do here is encourage letting go. So let's make this really practical. You wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning and, oh my God, I'm back in 5-MeO-DMT. Lie down on your back in your bed in this neutral position and just allow the experience. Now, in allowing the experience, we might find that there are vibrations running through the body. And so if you're vibrating like this, that's fine. Let yourself vibrate. Or maybe your body's convulsing, that's fine. There's nothing you need to do about it. You just stay calm, let your body vibrate. Let this happen. There also might be some movements that are taking place. And that's okay too. If these movements are happening, just let them happen. There's nothing you need to do with them. Just let it take place, and when the energy dies down, then the movements will stop. There also, just like in a session with 5-MeO-DMT, there might be the urge to express various emotions. You might need to cry, you might need to wail, you might need to make some sound, you might need to tone, you might need to gurgle, you might need to chirp, you might need to speak in tongues. And yes, if you're sleeping in bed with somebody else, this might be disturbing to them. So actually the best thing would be get up out of bed, go to another room where you can do all this and make sound and move, and you're not going to disturb your partner also sleeping in bed with you. But with just like in a session with 5-MeO-DMT, that if you feel like you need to scream, then you let yourself scream. If you feel that you need to cry, you let yourself cry. And the more you do it in a state of embodied bilateral symmetry, the less resistance there's going to be from your ego. So the more open you are to the full energetic process. When we really let go into these experiences, it can really distinctly feel like something else is taking you over. And here, if you're really available, like say you're lying on the floor rather than sitting in a chair or lying in bed, that your whole body can become involved, where your legs are going up in the air and they're rolling over your head, and then you might come down and you put your hands on the ground and you're arching up and then you're opening. And there also might be places where you pause, and usually the breath sinks in with all of this. So you feel all of this is one fluid movement that's taking place. Now, another thing that can show up, especially if you're really open to the energy that's in your hands, is you might find yourself creating these kinds of mudras with your hands and with your fingers. And they can go through different permutations, and these kinds of things can take place. And they can go here, or they might go down here, wherever. And what I always advise about these mudras is that sometimes people want to give an interpretation. And this is true for the movements, this is true for everything else. There is no interpretation. The interpretation is merely, this is how you are embodying and expressing energy at this time, but none of these things mean anything. Now, this could be a hard one for people because Buddhism and Hinduism and some of the other various religions that come out of India, they prioritize this concept of mudras and these hand positions, and they ascribe different meanings to different mudras and different hand positions. Say, well, this is the mudra of universal compassion, and this is the mudra of health and longevity. And that's all just a meaning-making system, and I encourage you not to import any meaning-making systems into this. This is merely energetic processing and the potential for energetic reformatting to bring you into greater alignment with these deeper levels of yourself and less trapped by the unconscious energetic structures of the ego. So these kinds of things do show up. Also, as I've already mentioned, there can be glossolalia, which is known as speaking in tongues. In Christianity, speaking in tongues is taken as a sign that you are interacting with the Holy Spirit or something like that, and that people work to interpret speaking in tongues and maybe even sometimes call it the language of angels. And here again, I just encourage you, please do not introduce any interpretations. It's just the vocalizing of the energy in the moment. And that's all that it is. And that can include gurgles, clicks, purrs, whistles, growls, all different kinds of sounds. None of it carries any inherent meaning or any interpretive need. It's just the embodiment and expression of energy in that very moment. Somewhat similar with the interpretations and importing of meaning is that sometimes people want to say that these kinds of events, these reactivations on 5-MeO-DMT are a, quote, Kundalini awakening. Please just keep in mind that the entire concept of Kundalini awakening was something that was basically made up by the Kundalini yoga cult, and it's just cult propaganda. I mean, just leave it behind. Just don't even think about Kundalini awakening, because that's not what's going on here. Also, sometimes people feel energy in different places in their body and they want to map it onto the chakra system, usually mispronounced as chakras. And here again, this is, please just don't. There's no need to do that. That your energetic system is here in your body. We do not need to introduce these symbols of chakras and colors and different associations. That those are all, it's all just meaning-making systems. And we want to avoid as much meaning-making as possible so that we can just be present for what is the energetic process that's taking place. The primary concern is, am I available to it? Am I allowing it? And am I letting this energy move and be embodied and be expressed? And the more you do that, then the more the work of the energy is taking place. And therefore, the sooner you will get to the end of the unwanted reactivations. Now, normally, most reactivations tend to subside within about 2 weeks' time. Sometimes they do last longer than that. If you are resisting them and fighting with them, there's a good chance they're going to last longer than 2 weeks. Also, there are occasions where people are just having such a tough time with reactivations that they're not really able to surrender with them, and they're not able to really make progress with them. If that is you, sometimes the best way of dealing with them is actually going back and taking more 5-MeO-DMT and really surrendering and opening to that process, because it's easy for these waves of energy to hit resistance within our being, within our body. And sometimes we're holding on and we're creating resistance at a deeply unconscious level, and we don't know where it is. So we don't know how to relax that, how to open it up, how to allow that to process more. And then someone just ends up struggling with these reactivations for months on end. And in the cases where I have advised people to go back and work with 5-MeO-DMT again, almost always they say that was definitely the best choice, and that allowed me to resolve this energetic process by entering back into it fully. So that is a valid method for overcoming deeply disturbing unwanted reactivations. But I would also advise it's best to talk with facilitators and integration coaches before making that decision, just to see where you're at. Another way of working with the reactivations is really purposefully engaging in what my friend Hal at the Temple of Awakening Divinity gave the name of fractal energetic yoga. So this is something that you can see me doing in a variety of videos that I've posted. And I've shown a little bit of it here, but it's this idea that we can work with our bodies using bilateral symmetry, and that these kinds of movements directly embody and express how energy moves on 5-MeO-DMT. So if we start working with these kinds of movements and allowing ourselves to move this way, we can re-enter into these highly charged energetic states of 5-MeO-DMT. But it's not yoga in the sense that there are specific poses, or that you are following a regimen of first this side, then that side, first this exercise, then this exercise. It's this free-form exploration of embodied symmetry through these fluid, rolling, symmetrical movements. Now, this also relates to even doing a seated meditation, allowing a reactivation to take place. Sometimes people want to sit in meditation posture with their legs crossed over each other. And if they're doing that, the legs and arms are actually energetic conduits. And so we want to be more in a position like this. So if you want to do a seated meditation, you should do it like this, or perhaps sitting on your knees, but not with legs crossed. Because when people go into a highly energetically open and charged state, if their legs are crossed, they're cutting off the entire bottom half of their body. And what tends to happen is people get into these swirling vortexes like this, because the energy is being pinched down here in our abdomen. We want is for the full potential for the energy to open up all the way, so we can open up in these star positions. But if the legs are crossed, then the energy is pinched, and then it starts swirling like this. Now, I know that some people think that vortices are somehow special and sacred, and so they get excited if they start going like this. But I will just tell you, that's actually an indication that you are cutting off your energy. You're pinching it, you're restricting it. So you want to have open symmetry within the body so that you are fully available for all of this energy to express and move. Okay? So I think I'm just looking at my list here. I think I've covered everything that I want to cover around reactivations, but just to kind of sum it all up again, it's a normal part of working with 5-MeO-DMT. Not everybody gets reactivations. Probably the majority of people do. Unwanted reactivations that happen at nighttime. Those are the ones that are most important, that you really fully surrender to and allow that process to move out and complete. It might require you to get up out of bed so that you can do some of these symmetrical movements, so you can vocalize, so you can vibrate. Feeling uncontrolled movements in the body, that's a normal part of these reactivations. Feeling lots of vibrations, tremors, and even convulsions in the body, that's a normal part of reactivations. Experiencing all kinds of emotional releasing that sometimes feel out of your control, also a normal part of experiencing reactivations. So all of these elements, they all come together to help reformat and recondition you. The more open and available you are to them, the more thoroughly and quickly it can do its work, and then you can go back to, okay, I'm not waking up at 3 a.m. every morning now, and I feel much better. And again, in the worst cases, where you're just not able to work at the reactivations and they keep coming and keep coming, sometimes going back and working with 5-MeO-DMT again and really choosing to fully surrender into it is highly recommended. And I'll just end with these book recommendations again. If you want to learn more about how to work with all of this, how all this energy works and why it works the way that it works, this new book of mine, 5-MeO-DMT Integration, Embodying Non-Duality is Not What You Think, Education and Empowerment for Working with the God Molecule. I recommend this. Also my 2017 book, Entheogenic Liberation. And if you would like to book a consultation call with me in order to help you through this process and through these experiences, I'm available for 30, 60, and 90-minute video calls, and just visit non-dual-entheogenic-integration.com for more information and can set up a call. I hope you've enjoyed this video and have found it educational and informative and empowering for you in working through your process with 5-MeO-DMT and any potential reactivations that you might be experiencing. Thanks for watching.